Welcome, everyone, and you are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I am your host, Chris Aversano. On today's podcast, we will have Dr. Arlie Sterling, president and co-founder of Marsoft, Inc. Dr. Sterling has a BS from MIT, an MS from Northwestern, and a PhD in applied economics from MIT Sloan School. Dr. Sterling's company, Marsoft, prepares clients for the lending and investment decisions they face in the volatile and cyclical industry by signaling the key risks and structural changes and the potential impact of geopolitical instability. Recently, Marsoft's Green Screen program, which is new, opens the doors to carbon credit origination, verification, and certification, and essential steps to monetizing the value of the reduction of carbon emissions delivered by retrofit investments. Arlie is well known on the speaking circuit, talking at Marine Money and the CMA trade show. And for anyone that has not heard him speak or moderate a panel, it's definitely worth a listen. Dr. Sterling will be speaking at the Marine Money Climate Week in September, and then at the ASBA Cargo Conference in Miami at the end of September, and I'll be there. Arlie, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Chris, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate the opportunity. Looking forward to our conversation.
I look forward to it. Many people know about your history, but for those that don't, can you give me a little bit about the background of yourself and kind of how you got yourself here today?
Sure. Well, the story for me was really those graduate student days at MIT, Chris, where the first thing you had to do as a graduate student is make sure you had a job in a research project, because you need to eat as well as study. And I got a project on the oil markets and flow of oil around the world and how the price of oil was determined. It was an assessment of OPEC behavior and its consequences for oil prices and oil trade. And that I spent many hours in the basement of the Sloan School building models and doing analysis of supply and demand and all those things that economists do. As we completed the project, I learned a little bit more about the background for why we got that project. It turns out that it was financed by the Norwegian National Science Foundation on behalf of the Norwegian Shipowners Association, who at that time, and this is really the distant past now, Chris, had suffered from a series of unbelievably bad decisions. The Norwegian National Science Foundation had funded this project in part to contribute to the industry making better decisions. So it went to Oslo, made a presentation of the results, and realized that at that time, we had this great analytical work that was in place, literally for a while punching cards. But we could take all that analytics and move it into a PCs that were just coming out at that time. And we could make the whole analysis alive. We could make it much more relevant and engaging for decision makers. So not only did we have the very deep analytics and that kind of that MIT firepower that we could show off, but we could show it off in a fashion that it was much more effective for ship owners making decisions around and being concerned about OPEC behavior. That really became the basis for Marsoft. We were carrying around our computers, that first generation of IBM so-called desktop. You remember those? They were big old sewing machines. Carrying those around Oslo, showing them off to ship owners. And we really started at that point the decision support business that became Marsoft and grew over time to expand to many other markets, focus more on risk management work over time. A lot of the work that the banks did in credit rating and portfolio management still. So our work grew from the market research and analysis and decision support into more credit rating and portfolio management work. And most of the major shipping banks are still using those services. And we estimate that some 80% of ship finance transactions wind up going through those systems in one way or another. So it continues to be a very important part of our business. The work we're doing now involves a little shift in focus, still involving helping owners make the right decisions in complex and uncertain times, but in this case, really about carbon and focusing on decarbonization and the most cost-effective ways of meeting the industry's goal to decarbonize over the next several years. And so we're really excited about that new initiative. It's promising to take us off in a really exciting new direction for Marsoft. And I look forward to talking more about that as we go forward.
Oh, I would love to hear it, but really, I mean, what is surprising to me, what I guess I knew but really didn't think about, is that you have always been a digital company, whether the end users use the product, like now, like you can go on, log in, and figure some stuff out, or you were using the digital technology, like you said, the sewing machine size computers downstairs in the basement of MIT, and now it probably has more horsepower on your phone or my phone. Being a digital company, and certainly looking at pivoting, you mentioned what you're getting in with the carbon credits. That's a pivot into two of the major buckets that we see going on in shipping and has been, right? One is digitization, which you clearly are in the forefront of, but then the other part is emissions and emissions control and tracking. Really exciting stuff. Talk a little bit about that and kind of how that's been well received. And is this something that is driven by you coming up with an idea, or is this client driven, or maybe a little bit of both?
Yeah, gee, that's a great question, Chris. The just to comment on Marsoft as a digital pioneer, our focus has always been on helping make better decisions. And so the for us, the access to the power of the computers and the tools that we could run, the software that we could run on the computers, meant that we could present information, we could answer questions more effectively, we could engage with decision makers more effectively than what at that time was the traditional way of approaching them through a paper report and drinks over lunch to discuss it. For us, the digital was taking a traditional decision making style and enriching it, making it more effective, making it faster. And so we never thought of ourselves as a digital company per se. Someone who knew a lot about how to use the power of that was coming to our desktop to make better decisions. It was really using the digital capabilities that is where Marsoft stands out most distinctly, in my view.
This is the next step about what you're doing with the carbon credits. But you go back to your original joke around, your original thesis, which it was of learning about the oil industry, learning about the correlation with shipping. And then over time, I imagine, and this is a real big theme that I find when I talk to other people in the digital realm, especially founders like yourself who started off one way and then kind of maybe had a digital component, or like you, was reliant, is that you have the deep domain expertise, right? You're not just building something today to do whiz bang. You saw a problem, you were able to build the relationships. Like you said, many of the banks and the lenders are still using your product today after many, many years. And that builds a deep domain expertise on your end, which you can then pivot into kind of your new offering, right? I mean, because really, you could probably do new offerings and you see it happen all the time that could be similar, but you have that deep domain expertise to know exactly how people can use it in their day-to-day work life.
I'm tremendously proud of domain expertise, as you put it, of the Marsoft team. My colleagues and I have studied the industry for many, many years, learned a lot in the process, and I feel we do have a certain degree of expertise. But the word you used earlier, relationships, Chris, is just so important in our business. And it's one thing to be academically astute. It's the other thing to be able to learn from your clients, learn from people who you want to be working with about what they think is important. And I must say, the banking industry and our relationships within the banking industry have been very instrumental in driving us towards focusing on decarbonization as a key issue. Shipping really took a leadership position, Poseidon principles. So the shipping banks are driving change, took a step forward in a fashion that I think is very constructive and brought a lot of new light to the industry. And when you see players like Citibank and SocGen and the many others who have joined that group, say, well, that's something important. I need to be at that table as well. Our approach traditionally has not been so much a stick approach. Our approach is to find where the carrots are in this. And one of the things we had a chance to learn about, in addition to the need to decarbonize, is the value of carbon in the voluntary carbon markets. there are a lot of regulatory markets for which some owners now fear they're going to be part of. But what we saw is there was an opportunity to bridge the traditional shipping markets and their decarbonization efforts with the voluntary carbon markets and really realize the value in a very concrete sense, in effect, to find a way to help companies like Microsoft and Amazon and the others who are focusing on that net zero objective to help fund progress in shipping to reduce emissions. And that's what we've done with the Green Screen program and our collaboration with Climeco. Climeco is one of the leaders in the carbon market space. They've been there for 15 years and have been innovating and leading that market. They did more than, I think, 25 million tons of carbon credits already originated and trade twice that volume. So they're a big player that have really, their commitment to Marsoft to support our Green Screen program, the collaboration with them to bring the carbon credits that we're generating via Green Screen to the carbon market delivers the greatest value and liquidity has been a big step forward for us this year.
I want to rewind one thing. You talk about the leadership in the shipping space, and I remember being at the Marine Money I think it was 2019 in June when you kicked off the Poseidon Principles. And I remember I was actually really excited about that because I said this was something where, the shipping industry and through the banks was kind of, in a way, I don't think kind of, actually is putting their money where their mouth is, right? Saying we have this issue, we need to address it. I'm of the believer that IMO, EU, the US, they're all collectively are probably never going to get on the same page. I mean, we could just see what happens here in the US, and it's not a political thing. You have one person that says no and everything gets changed. What I think is going to happen is, to quote the movie All the President's Men, follow the money. And I think that's good. That's where I think the most bang for the buck is, right? And this is where part of it. You can't get a loan unless you do these, make these improvements. And I think further, it's going to be, you look at last year where I think it was IKEA, where customers of IKEA were like starting to look at, how are you shipping these goods to these stores? Why are these ships, have spewing carbon and emissions to our stores? We don't want that. That's going to become very interesting when you start to put a carbon footprint on, your coffee mug, on your notebook, on your car. We talked about, I'm going to see you in Miami. I noticed through this booking agent that I had to use internally here at work, they have what the carbon rating is for that flight. They have it on there, how many tons or whatever it was. That's going to become more and more evident, I think, as shipping takes its lead. The Poseidon Principle, which works hand in hand with the Sea Cargo Charter Party, which works hand in hand now, I believe, for lack of a better term, is the Poseidon Principle for the insurance business, right, for the marine insurance business. These are all positive, but they're not waiting for IMO. They're using it as a guideline, but they're not waiting for the days to start. They're going out ahead of it. And I think that that's super important. And I think that that's where, initiatives and innovations like yours, and partnering and collaborating with companies outside of shipping, this can definitely help.
When you see the leadership that the Poseidon Principles and the Global Maritime Forum has brought to shipping, you realize it's not the outsiders who are driving this. It's IMO is in the background in many ways on this. These are really very much shipping market insiders, people who have been in the business for many years, who are making significant investments in new ships and new, more efficient ships. That's where the Poseidon Principles initiative originated. And that's where the groups like the Global Maritime Forum and many others here in the States, the Blue Sky Maritime Coalition is playing a big role. That's where you're seeing the industry coming together to try to find creative ways to approach what is a very complicated and costly problem. There's, I think, a little cheerleading that goes on. We all have to be kind of constantly encouraging one another about the progress, and we have to see where progress is being manifested and what we can learn from that, and be open to a lot of new ideas. I think the carbon markets can be an effective contributor to change. We've put a lot of resources into opening that door between shipping and the carbon markets. And it's a complicated business, but now that we've done all that, we can make it easy for ship owners to take advantage of those markets.
And I think that that's going to be something that we're going to see more of. And I think you hit on another key topic, and that's collaboration, even amongst competitors. I mean, that's always been one of the big problems, especially amongst ship owners. And I think it was 4 years ago at the Marine Money Conference. I was there the year prior, and somebody was talking about collaboration among ship owners. And I've told this story a few times on the podcast. A ship owner, a friend of mine, is like, yeah, that ain't going to happen, because the mindset was collaboration. His mind went right to talking about fixtures and other things, whereas it's really the operational collaboration, maybe some operational collaboration where it has to get a little bit more personal than in the past. But if you start to look at the greater picture of saving, reducing your emissions, carbon credits, carbon swaps, things like that, becomes a little bit more interesting overall. And I agree. I think there is a really good chance for shipping to be the leader on this one.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Being up in Boston, how is, that's a real, clearly my current company, Vesson, is a Boston-based company. We talked about other folks up in Boston. Are you seeing that that's a little bit of a hotbed, and has been really for 5 years? I mean, talk a little bit about being, one of the early founders up in Boston. You must be the king of Boston digital up there, right? Did they kiss the ring when you walk in the room?
No, Chris, I'm afraid the one aspect of the digital world is that there's always something shinier and brighter just ahead. And so I'm afraid I'm an old fogey in the digital world up here in Boston. But, you make a great point. We have this unique combination of institutions like MIT and Harvard and Boston University and Tufts, and, well, you name it. I think it's fair to say that many Greek and Norwegian ship owner has gone through these halls of learning here, and have learned to appreciate what can be done when you bring that intellectual firepower to the table. I think Boston's engagement right now is probably characterized by big data and what everyone is kind of salivating around AIS data, and yet another 10,000 seconds worth of vessel information, and combine it with a weather report and satellite this, and suddenly you're beginning to work with a treasure trove of data. In all honesty, I'm not sure I've seen the payoffs from that yet. The fact that the shipping industry can bring that information and it can be integrated in these exciting new ways, that just brings bright people into the business. It brings people who would not have been looking at shipping otherwise into the business. And that's very, very exciting. We're seeing a lot now of the autonomous vessel work, of course, being done here in various labs around the Boston area, building off the big data, the machine learning capabilities, and this multiple sensor abilities that people have seen in other industries, and bringing them to shipping. Yeah, it's really exciting. I think a lot of that work is often initiated by people who see the availability of data key to doing better. As we struggled with for many years early at Marsoft, it's not the data that makes a better decision. It's how you interpret and understand it. That step, for me, is still in front of a few of the initiatives that are underway in the digital frontier.
That brings me to kind of another question, and I wonder this: are we seeing the overall general tech bubble in the early 2000s, right? Where we had just the overall tech bubble, and the maritime industry was the digital maritime industry was much smaller. Now we're kind of much bigger. Are we at a tech bubble, do you think, or do we have a long way to go before we burst?
Tech bubble, that's interesting. We might be at a liner bubble. Quite sure how to interpret that. I think.
Well, you just mentioned, like, a lot of these companies, they have a lot of data, they do stuff with it. Are they going to be flash in the pan and they're a shiny object, or some of them, not all of them, and not just in Boston, but in globally, and especially you see all these incubators, and there's one up in Boston, and they run the gamut, anything ocean, right? Fisheries to erosion, to clean water, to optimization and routing. And they're not only here in the US, but you have a bit, the dock in Israel, you have ones in Singapore sponsored by the Singapore Maritime Authority, and then, other ones. You're seeing so much of this. Is there going to be a point, do you think, where there's contraction or these companies start to fade or some other outcome? That's, I think, more my question.
A lot of the promise of the digital revolution that's underway, Chris, is that it will make things run more smoothly. Ships will arrive in port at a more predictable time, and the people who are loading or discharging those ships will be there and available. And that's really a compelling story, driving the inefficiencies out of the system. Where we have yet to see the promise realized is that people don't necessarily understand why the inefficiencies exist. They don't understand that unions don't work 24/7. And therefore, you're not going to have the access to the labor that you need to discharge a ship if you route it optimally. They don't realize that the master aboard the vessel making a decision to route one way or another probably has a very good reason for it, and those reasons may not have been fully accounted for in the artificial intelligence or big data. And I think the reliance on what for many people is still a black box of machine learning techniques is a real weak point. Unless you can tell why a recommendation is a good one, it's very hard to motivate people to take it. It's hard to simply say, well, look, I've analyzed 500,000 data points, and more often than not, if you turn right rather than left, you get there faster. Pioneers in this area will be learning how to communicate how their very sophisticated analysis works in more tangible fashion, how it eliminates bottlenecks that exist because of third parties in the business, essentially. I think that'll be the transitions that they need to make.
The most interesting goes back to kind of my last comment, kind of what you bring to the table and what others who've been around is you have to have that deep domain experience, right? You have to understand, you have all this data, but what does it mean and how do you interpret it? And I think that's where some of the successful companies are going to be and, coming from, because you could throw, like you said, you could have hundreds of thousands of AIS points. Great. Well, what does it mean? And why are these things different or what have you? So I think that there's always that. And I think, I've talked to other folks in the, where they talk about machine learning and AI, and what can't be missed is, any of the decisions that have to be made have to have, human in the loop, right? So you're not making these things in a vacuum. There has to be a human someplace in a loop in order to make the optimal decision. I think that's where we're going to see. I'm curious to see over time, how many companies that are bright and shiny kind of flame out, especially as kind of the money and the tightening of the money becomes a little bit more of an acute matter here that we've experienced in the last, let's say, 12 to 18 months.
I'll give you an example, Chris, of how one has to be careful about these calculations. And it comes out of our work with MIT, the MIT Sea Grant Design Lab, to build some of the analytical tools that underlie our green screen offering. In conversations with the MIT team, they presented what for me was an alternative or a set of alternatives that I wasn't aware of about the analytical process that used to characterize how much better a ship will perform after you retrofit. They said you can either take a computational fluid dynamics approach, and we at MIT have wonderful people who have years of experience in programming these techniques, and you can go it that way. Or you can rely on thousands of tank test results and years of research in naval architecture and marine engineering as to how ships are actually built, and build a simulation tool. Something using, obviously, a lot of sophisticated software, but not using the very complex computational fluid dynamics. But they said, look, analytically simpler model, we can get you within 2% of the results, probably 80 to 90% of the time. Computational fluid dynamics, maybe you get to within 1.5%, maybe 80, 90% of the time. Is it worth paying a whole lot of money to do something which is state of the art, bright and shiny, and is what every class society prides itself on? Or are you going to do something which is a little bit more pragmatic, gets you the answer, gets it faster and cheaper? there are real trade-offs. Digital revolution is not necessarily cost effective. There are expensive and complicated things that software engineers can do that don't necessarily add the same value that business people might recognize.
Right. If you could take that 0.5% or 1% and say, well, I'm okay with that being a little off, and then turn around and use that, the delta in the money to invest in something else or hire somebody else or do something else, and then, recoup that difference right away, then that's, maybe that's the better thing. As we get to wrap up, I always love to ask this following question, this last question. And the question I love is what are you reading now? Sometimes I'll ask some people. I also get the same thing if you're writing anything. I've gotten a few people on who are writing books, which is kind of interesting. Don't know if you're doing that. I know you're busy, but we did just come off the summer season, and a lot of people do. They bring a few books to the beach and kind of read through that. So I always like to ask what people are reading.
Well, I'd say that's a great question, Chris. And I read earlier this year the story of the Lewis and Clark core exploration. Went up the Missouri River and attempted to find the waterborne passage to the West Coast. As I read that, of course, the challenges and the world they were operating in at that time are very difficult for us to understand how hard that expedition was. But I found it fascinating. And so I just back from a 2-week trip where I spent a week of that canoeing down the Missouri River, down the same cliffs, the same path that Lewis and Clark took on their way back, and came to better appreciate what they went through on that expedition. So not only did I do a little bit of reading, but I also took a trip down the Missouri River that was inspired by it.
Well, that's absolutely one of the coolest answers I've gotten. I've gotten a few people, like I said, who've written books, and we've talked about some things. And one of my early guests says, well, I have a couple of young kids, so I do audio books, he goes, it's kind of cheating. I go, well, no, that's not, whatever, man. But no, it's all good. So no, I just want to thank you again, Arlie. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking about kind of your evolution and certainly important work that you're doing with the green screen. And I wish you the best of luck on that, and look forward to seeing you speak in person. And then for anybody that's interested, you'll be also speaking at ASBA and as well as the Marine Money. I think that's a virtual conference, the Climate Week conference as well. So you'll be back to back there.
That's right. So there'll be a couple of opportunities, and my colleagues are going to be in Copenhagen for the Marine Money at the beginning of September, and as well as in Athens in October. So you'll have a chance to see Marsoft at several of these events. And hope you ask us about green screen.
Well, it's fantastic. Well, thanks again for coming on. I do appreciate it, and then thanks for sharing with us.
Thanks very much, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of The Last Dinosaur. You can find out more about Dr. Sterling, Marsoft, Climeco, and the new green screen product in the show notes. The Last Dinosaur can be found in all places you normally get your podcasts, such as iTunes, Amazon, Spotify, and on YouTube. Once again, I'm your host, Chris Aversano, wishing you fair winds and following seas.